We smoked 53 pork butts for a local church event and put them into 6 coolers to find out the best cooler for doing a hot hold when you're cooking barbecue. And we've got all the data coming up. There are coolers that can do so much more than just keep drinks cold. Many can also be used as a food warmer to keep food hot for a long period of time, and we proved that in the video that we released a few weeks ago called How Long Can We Rest Barbecue? If you haven't seen it, I'll link it in the card up here and in the description below. Now, the natural next phase of testing is to figure out which brand or size of cooler can hold barbecue meat the longest to give us 10 to 12 hours of hot holding time from the time that we take the meat off the pit to the time that we serve it to customers and guests. Now, we were asked to cook pulled pork for 800 plus people at a church event in our town, and it seemed like the perfect opportunity to run this test. Now, I contacted Yeti, Blue Coolers, and Dometic and asked them if I could put their coolers to the test hot holding barbecue, and we were sent some sample units to utilize in this test. So some of these coolers are owned by me and friends of mine. Others were sent to us to use for this test, but here are the rules. It doesn't matter to me how the coolers got here because it's the data that's going to be doing the talking in this video. Data is data, and that's what we're going to share, and here's how we got each of these coolers. Yeti sent us a Tundra 45 to use for this test, and my buddy Joel had a Tundra 75 and 125 that he let me borrow. Blue Coolers sent us a 20-quart Ice Vault and a 110-quart Arc Series on wheels. Dometic sent us a Patrol 55 to round out the testing group, so we have 6 coolers to test in this video. At no point do any of these manufacturers have any say in what we report here or how the test came out, so here we go. Now, if you watched our last video in this series, How to Smoke Pulled Pork and Side Dishes for over 800 people and still get a full night of sleep, you already know the story here. But for those of you who missed that one, I'll leave a link in the description below for you to check it out. But to catch you up, basically we were tasked with feeding roughly 800 people a fresh barbecue lunch at 11:30 a.m. on Sunday. In order to avoid losing a full night of sleep while cooking, we decided to utilize a method known as hot hold that would allow us to do all the cooking the day before the event and then hold the meat at a food-safe temperature above 140 degrees Fahrenheit overnight to serve the next morning. We started the cook on Saturday at 1 p.m. and finished at midnight with all 53 pork butts in a cooler. Now, every one of these pork butts spent a minimum of 10.5 hours in a cooler overnight before they were served, and we captured the results on our ThermoWorks Signals thermometers using a meat probe in a butt and an air probe to measure the air temperature. In order to make sure that we were getting the air temperature and not just the heat coming off the pork shoulders, we put a towel on top of the top butt in the cooler and rested the air probe on top of a towel as a buffer. So all of the graphs you're going to see for each cooler will have 2 lines to follow. A line showing the temperature of the meat and a line showing the internal temperature of the cooler over a 10 to 12 hour period. The first pork butts started coming off the pits at 10 p.m. and after venting them for about 10 minutes, we started by filling the Yeti 75 first. We sealed the cooler at 10:20 p.m. and the pork internal temperature was 194.8 while the cooler internal temperature was 112.3 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, one of the trends that you're going to see when you look over these graphs from the ThermoWorks Signals thermometers is that even though we warmed up the coolers with boiling water, we aren't starting with air temperature inside the coolers much higher than room temperature. This was started at 40 degrees warmer than room temp, but the purpose of the boiling water inside isn't to raise the air temperature. As soon as you open the cooler, the air temperature is lost. The goal of the water was to heat up the insulation in the walls of the cooler as much as possible, so what you're going to see is the air temperature rising over the first 30 to 60 minutes before it starts to tail off and head back down overnight. The Yeti 75 held this pork for a total of 12 hours and 45 minutes, and the pork was still reading 149.7 degrees while the air temperature was at 135.1 degrees. That's a 45.1 degree drop in pork temperature and a 22.8 degree rise in air temperature for the Yeti 75. Now we filled the Yeti 45 next at 10:30 p.m. and it held pork for a total of 12 hours and 28 minutes with a starting meat temperature of 192.1 and an air temperature of 114.4. At 10:58 a.m. the next morning, the pork was reading 144.1 degrees and the air temperature was 128.5 degrees for a 48 degree drop in the pork temperature and a 14.1 degree rise in the air temperature. Now the Blue 110 was next up, and we sealed the top at 11:07 p.m. with a meat temperature of 192.2 and an air temperature of just 86 degrees. Now one of the trends that we noticed is that the larger the cooler, the more we had to open and close it to fill it up, and the air temperature dropped much lower than with the smaller units. The Blue 110 held for a total of 11 hours and 58 minutes, and when we opened the cooler at 11:05 a.m. the next day, the pork was reading 159 degrees, and the internal cooler temperature was 147.1 degrees, a drop of 34.3 degrees for the pork butt and a rise of 61.1 degrees for the cooler temperature. The Blue 60 was up next, and we finished that up at 11:38 p.m. for an 11 hour and 20 minute hold. We let this pork vent a little longer than the others on accident, so when we went in, we had a starting temperature of 163.6 degrees with an air temperature of 94.1 degrees. Now we opened the cooler the next morning at 10:58 a.m. and found the pork holding at 152.5 degrees with an air temperature of 142.3 degrees. To our surprise, putting pork that had cooled into the 160s still resulted in an ending temperature in the 150s. That's just an 11.1 degree drop over 11 hours and 20 minutes and a 48.2 degree rise in air temperature. Now this is a fascinating result, so we'll come back to this here in a second. The Dometic 55 was next to last to fill at 12:02 a.m. and the meat temperature was 181.9 with an air temperature of 118.3. We opened the Dometic at 10:58 a.m. for a total hold time of 10 hours and 56 minutes. The pork cooled 31.1 degrees to 150.8 degrees and the air temperature warmed up 18 degrees to 136.3 degrees. The Yeti 125 was the absolute last cooler to fill, and we closed it up at 12:05 a.m. The pork internal temperature was 191.4 degrees with a cooler air temperature of only 82 degrees. We held the pork until 10:46 a.m. for a total hold time of 10 hours and 41 minutes and saw a 42.8 degree drop in pork temperature to 148.6 degrees. The air temperature rose 52.4 degrees to 134.4 degrees as well. Now, so that is an absolute mountain of data. But how do we interpret all of this? Now, the first thing I want to point out is that every cooler in this test was able to hold barbecue meat at a food-safe temperature above 140 degrees for 10 to 12 hours without any trouble. It doesn't matter the brand or the size, they all accomplished the mission. Now that being said though, looking at this data, we're not really comparing apples to apples. Some of these held meats for 2 hours longer than the others. Some started holding at around 10 p.m. and others after midnight, but the shortest hold was still over 10.5 hours. Now that is a data point that we can look at for every cooler, so here's the data of what happened in each cooler in the first 10.5 hours for the pork temps. The 60-quart blue cooler only lost 9.7 degrees in 10.5 hours for first place. The Dometic 55-quart lost 30.2 degrees for second place, and the Blue 110 lost 32.4 degrees for third place. The three Yeti coolers take positions 4, 5, and 6, with the Yeti 75 losing 41 degrees, the Yeti 125 losing 42.3 degrees, and the Yeti 45 losing 44.5 degrees over the 10.5 hour period. Now looking at the air temperatures inside the coolers, we have the Blue 110 gaining 63.1 degrees for first place, the Yeti 125 gaining 52.8 degrees for second place, and the Blue 60 gaining 49.2 degrees to claim third place. The Yeti 75 comes in fourth with 26.3 degrees gained, the Dometic in fifth with 18.9 degrees gained, and the Yeti 45 in last place with 17.1 degrees gained for the internal air temperature. Now, let's argue about that. Couldn't it be that the air temperature in the larger coolers would naturally get higher than the others because there was more pork in each compared to the smaller ones? Well, sure, that would make sense. Now, could it also be that the fact that some pork was vented longer than others is skewing the data with lower starting temperatures? Sure, valid point. We'll be the first to admit that this test is not completely flawless and is just not 100% scientific. I think we can all agree that keeping every single variable consistent from cooler to cooler during a cook of this magnitude is just basically impossible. Just know that our team made every attempt that we could to keep things fair and consistent along the way, but ultimately our first and primary goal was feeding the masses some delicious barbecue. Now, we hope that you enjoyed geeking out on some of the data we collected throughout the process, but now that it's been a month since we filmed all of this, I want to give you my take on hot holding barbecue and using coolers to do it. First, the pork itself was next level delicious. The hot hold kept the pork juicy and succulent, and it was some of the best pork that I've ever cooked. I usually rest my pork for 2 hours, but I'm on team overnight rest now. It made a huge difference in the final result. Second, I'd take any of these coolers to an overnight barbecue cook. This roto-molded design is great for hot holding meat, and they all performed well. If I was going to just grab a single cooler out of the 6, I'd probably ask myself what else I'm going to use it for. Do I regularly have a need to keep 125 quarts of beverages on ice? Is 50 to 60 quarts more realistically something I'd use on a weekly or monthly basis? Those would be some determining factors for me. So if it was up to me to pick just a single cooler out of the 6, I'd pick the Blue 60 quart for no other reason than the stellar temperature results with the pork butts. Only dropping 11 degrees in 11 hours and 20 minutes is remarkable, and that's the cooler that I'd take with me if I was going to do this again. But I'll follow that statement up by saying again, every single cooler 100% succeeded in what I asked them to do. I also want to say a huge thanks to Kyle at ThermoWorks for helping me sift through this sea of data collected by our ThermoWorks signals. If you'd like to learn more about these 4-channel Wi-Fi thermometers, I'll put a link in the description below where you can watch our full review of those. We'll also include links to each of the coolers we used in this video. Now they are affiliate links, which means that if you do decide to make a purchase, it won't cost you anything extra, but the manufacturers will give us a small percentage of the sale to say thanks for sending you their way. And we want to say thank you to you for supporting our channel in that way. Now, to make sure you don't miss out on future content like this, subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell. To know what we're up to behind the scenes and where we might be doing a live cook next, be sure to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, Twitter, and all of the socials. That's where we let you know what's coming up before it hits the YouTubes, so come on behind the scenes with us and see what's going on between videos. Now, for example, you should have seen what happened when we brought a Weber Smokefire home this week. That's a whole nother story in itself. So join us on social if you want to know more. I'm David Gafford from the BBQ Lab, and I can't wait to see you next time.